I'm going to show you how to pass in different types of inputs into an Orchestrator workflow. Let's get started. Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. In the previous video, I showed you how to run an Orchestrator workflow with two inputs, but both inputs were of type string. So in this video, what we're going to do is take a look at how to run Orchestrator workflows that have inputs of different types. Let's head off to the lab environment. Let's take a look at the Orchestrator workflow that we're going to be using in this video's demonstration. There is an Orchestrator workflow called Hello, Hello, Hello. That name is meant to suggest that instead of saying hello once, this workflow is going to go through a loop and say hello as many times as we tell it to. Speaking of which, if you take a look at the Inputs tab, you'll notice that once again we're asking for the user's first name and their last name, but this time we're going to ask how many times they want us to say hello. And since we're asking a number, the type of this input is number. Now there's one other thing to take a look at real quickly here, which is that we have a variable, formerly known as attributes, but this is a variable called counter, which is going to be our counter variable. So we'll go through this loop as many times as necessary until the counter exceeds the how many times input. Now that we know about the new workflow, let's go back to Postman. And in Postman, we need to go back to our VVork environment variables. So here's a bunch of variables in Postman. The one we're looking for in particular is workflow name. And we're going here because we need to change the workflow ID of the workflow that we want to run. So this time, what we're looking to do is run the workflow called Hello, Hello, Hello. Remember to save your change. Go back to our REST request called get workflow ID by workflow name and run the request. We got back at 200, so things are looking good. That means when we go to our run workflow REST request, our workflow ID should match the workflow ID of hello, hello, hello. So just double checking this here. This one ends in echo 890, and our hello, hello, hello workflow, according to the summary tab, is that exact same workflow ID. Ends in echo 890. So we're in good shape. Let's go back to Postman. And in Postman, taking a look at the request for running the workflow, we already know how this works. And we know that if we want to pass in inputs, we're going to do that through the body. This is the body that we used when we wanted to pass in two inputs. You'll recall those two inputs were the first name and the last name, and both of those were strings. But what if you wanted to additionally pass in a third input and have that third input be a different data type? In our example, it's going to be a number. I would encourage you to hit pause and think about what does this body need to look like if we want to pass in a number. So go ahead and hit pause and consider that fascinating question. All right, now that you've thought through that fascinating question, let's get rid of the two input body, and we're going to enter the three input body. So for the three input body, lines 4 through 15 are describing the first input. You'll recall that the first input is first name, it's a string, and we're passing in the value Brian. In the next section, we have lines 16 through 27 to pass in the second input. Second input's the last name. That's a string. We're passing in Watrous. And then the final newly added input is this one here. Lines 28 through 39 are passing in the input called how many times, which is a number. And the value we're going to assign this time is 4. We want it to say hello 4 times. That looks good. Why don't we go ahead and send this request? So we click send. We check that we got back a status code 200. We could look at the response here, but you know me. I like to copy the response and take that response over to Notepad++. So over here in Notepad++, let's paste in that new response body, and let's use our good old JSON Tools plugin to pretty things up. And in case we need it, we'll open the JSON tree viewer over here. So we ran the workflow and we've gotten back a response body. What does the response body have in terms of information to tell us? Well, it tells us lots of things like the ID of the workflow that we're running, the name of the workflow is hello, hello, hello. But crucially here, what we see is that we have some input parameters. Now, if we fully expand this here, we're going to see all of the information that we passed in. For example, here's first name, here's last name. And if we expand the third entry here, we can see that the value that we passed in for how many times is the number 4. Let's go double check this over in Orchestrator. In Orchestrator, let's close out of this workflow. We'll go to Activity Workflow Runs. We'll take a look at the workflow runs. Here's hello, hello, hello. If we go into the Logs tab, we should see that it says hello 4 times. Let's grab the resize handle and count them. Hello, Brian Watrous, 1, 2, 3, 4 different times, which is exactly what we wanted. So again, what we've done in this part of this video's demonstration is to show how to pass in a number. But number and string are definitely not the only data types. There are more exciting data types, such as good old VC::virtual machine. So next up, what I want to do is to point you to an excellent resource that's going to help you find out information about how you pass in more complex objects such as VC::virtual machine. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to paste in a URL. I'll put this URL into the YouTube description down below, but this URL is going to take us to a blog post by my colleague, William Lamb. This blog post is an excellent resource for you for what we're trying to do. What William has done in this article is to provide a detailed explanation for how to craft the request body to send in an input of a fancier type, such as VC::virtual machine. The examples that William's giving are examples that are making use of object types defined by the vCenter plugin. He uses vCenter for his examples, but you can apply the general concepts that he's talking about here to pass in objects of potentially any sort. So any sort of object that you see in the API Explorer can be passed in as an input, but you need to understand how to do it. And that's what William's blog post is going to show you. So I'm going to conveniently punt on this over to William. He's a great guy. He's super smart. This is an excellent article. You need to go read it. Join me in the next video as we continue to explore the Orchestrator REST API.